Hi. So Rabbi Jonathan Sachs tells this story about the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe tells his students, "You must live according to the times." And the students are a little puzzled by what exactly that means. And the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe explains, and I'm paraphrasing here, essentially that what live by the times means is that you should use the weekly Torah portion as a lens through which to understand your time. You should see it as a reflection of the events that are happening around you in the world. And I think that's a very powerful concept right now. Yesterday, many Jews read in Shul Parshat Vayera, and I want to read a little snippet from that week's Torah portion. It goes, God appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted his eyes and looked, and lo, three men were standing over against him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent entrance and bowed down to the earth. And Sachs makes the point that as this passage is interpreted in Jewish tradition, the way it's interpreted is that God comes to Abraham to speak to Abraham, and then Abraham sees these three men, these three strangers who are coming towards him, and he essentially tells God to pause. Says, God, sorry, I can't talk to you right now. There's a greater imperative that I have, which is to welcome these strangers. And then Abraham feeds them and bathes them. And from this passage, the rabbis in Tractate Shabbat in the Babylonian Talmud take the principle that greater is hospitality than receiving the divine presence. And then as the story continues, those three men who turn out to be angels, after giving Abraham and Sarah the news that Sarah will have a child, they go on to Sodom, the city of Sodom, where Abraham's relative Lot lives. And Lot also welcomes them into his home. But because the city of Sodom is ferociously hostile to strangers, to outsiders, the people of Sodom come and demand that Lot hand over these strangers to them so they can do violence, indeed sexual violence, to these strangers. And when Lot refuses, they threaten him. And then the angels take Lot and his immediate family out, and the city is destroyed. I think to go back to the point of the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, to read these parsha according to the times, it seems to me really hard not to read this parsha against the backdrop of the impending mass deportation of potentially millions of extremely vulnerable Americans by the Trump administration. And, what happens in the wake of elections is that people want to be politically savvy. And so they feel like, well, people have voted for a tough on immigration policy. So there must be some merit in this. There might be some wisdom in this. No, it's certainly true that our immigration system is deeply, deeply problematic, that we need many, many, many more judges and officers to handle asylum claims, that our asylum system doesn't work very well, that we need a much, much higher levels of legal immigration, that the whole system absolutely is very, very dysfunctional. But the answer to that dysfunction, again, is to have an asylum process that works, and to have an immigration process that actually responds to the needs of the United States to bring a lot of people into the country, because actually our economy needs that, even though we also need to redistribute the economic benefits better of that immigration. But the fact that many Americans voted for Donald Trump's mass deportation plan doesn't change the fact that it is a brutal, cruel policy that, if implemented even partially, will be a tremendous stain on this country. And people need to remember that oftentimes things that are done in America that we feel most shameful about enjoyed widespread support from both the populace and many elites at the time. And I think what Parsha Vayera, the point it makes is you can't actually have an authentic, genuine relationship with God if you don't also care about vulnerable people in your midst. And in this case, the vulnerable people being the stranger, the outsider, many of these undocumented immigrants. And again, this will also affect many, many legal immigrants as well, including people who've risked their lives for the United States, like people who were brought from Afghanistan, who fought alongside the United States in America's long war there. These are many of the hardest working, most vulnerable most decent people in the United States who are contributing the most and getting the least from our country. And to watch them be treated in this kind of brutal, dehumanizing, vicious way that we're seeing is exactly the opposite of the message from this week's Parsha. And I think there's something else to say about this week's Parsha that should be particularly important for Jews to remember. Interestingly, again, in this spirit of living according to the times, it was also on Parsha, during Parsha Vayera, that the Pittsburgh shooting massacre of the synagogue took place. And if you think about Lot as representing the role of the Jew, that what does Lot do? He extends sympathy to the stranger and then is turned upon for having extended sympathy to the stranger himself. The Torah tells us 36 times that you should remember the heart of the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. In a way, that's what Lot does. And that makes him vulnerable to people who, because they hate the stranger, they then decide that he is also a stranger, that he is also an outsider. And this is what happened in the Pittsburgh massacre, in a way, that the shooter initially was obsessed with the supposed threat of an immigrant invasion from Central America. But then, because he saw that that there was a synagogue nearby that was partnering with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society to support the rights of immigrants and asylum seekers in the United States, he decided that Jews were complicit in this quote unquote invasion, that they were a danger. And so he turned on them, just as the people of Sodom turned on Lot, because Lot had welcomed the stranger in his midst. And so I think there is a very, very important message from our tradition here for Jews as well. And for the forces in the Jewish community that either support Trump outright or are going to accommodate to Trump in various ways, that this brutal nativist xenophobia that is going to blight and destroy the lives of so many undocumented immigrants mostly from the global South is unlikely to end there. That this kind of cruelty, this kind of dehumanization doesn't usually end with one group of people. And precisely because Jews have it in our tradition to stand up for the stranger and will disproportionately oppose what Trump wants to do, that will increase the risk that people turn on Jews, just as the Pittsburgh shooter did, and just as happened in the story with Lot in Sodom. And it's why we need to not fall into the trap of thinking that because most Jews in America today are not immigrants, are not undocumented, have a relative degree of privilege, that we can stand back from our gated kind of worlds and look at this and say it doesn't really affect us. I think the message of Parsha Ve'era is that when you violate the stranger, you make everybody unsafe and you disconnect yourself from God.